My name's Christina Harvey, and I'm the Executive Director of Stand Up America. We're a national organization of over 2 million people in every state in the country who are standing up for the democracy we deserve, standing up for voting rights, to dilute the power of corporate money in our elections, and to break down barriers to progress, from the filibuster to the Electoral College. We're here today to talk about how we can build a firewall this year, really over the next 90-plus days, to ensure that the person who walks into the White House in January of 2025 is the person who was elected by the American voters. We came dangerously close to this not happening for the first time in the history of our nation in 2020. And every election after that, we want the person who walks into the White House to be the person who is selected by the American voters. According to a recent Washington Post analysis, election deniers, that's MAGA Republicans who still claim that Joe Biden lost the 2020 election. Election deniers make up 2/3 of Republican nominees in key swing states for offices like Secretary of State, Attorney General, Governor, and House and Senate seats. And some of the most strident election deniers are seeking offices like Secretary of State, where they would oversee our elections and have key roles in certifying those elections. Just to give you an idea of what our democracy is up against this year, Arizona Republican nominee for Secretary of State Mark Finchem, who continues to be an election denier, who was present at the January 6th Capitol insurrection, has proposed banning early voting, restricting access to mail-in voting, which is a key way voters vote in Arizona, and allowing the Arizona state legislature to reject the will of the voters. We are incredibly lucky to be joined here today by Cisco Aguilar, who is the Democratic nominee for Secretary of State in the state of Nevada, to talk about how secretaries of state who are democracy warriors can serve as a firewall for democracy in 2024 and going forward. But because this panel is a bit of a sampler platter of democracy protection here at Netroots, we're not going to stop there with secretaries of state. We're also going to be talking about some key pro-democracy ballot initiatives. And that's why Joel Edmond and Sharon Delente from Arizona and Michigan, respectively, are here to talk about the ballot measures that they hope to have on the ballot this November. Pro-democracy ballot measures in Michigan and Arizona that will not only expand and protect the freedom to vote, but will also stop future election sabotage. And I said this was a sampler platter, so we won't even stop with those ballot initiatives. We're going to keep going. We're also going to talk about state Supreme Court seats. For some folks who were in the panel yesterday about state courts, you heard just how powerful state courts can be. And today, Michael Ambler from ACLU has also joined us to talk about the role specifically that members of state Supreme Courts have in protecting our democracy and in empowering voters or suppressing the voices of voters. So a huge thank you to all of our panelists who flew in from states across the country to be part of this conversation today. This important conversation today about how we can work together in the next 90-plus days to build a democracy firewall. So, as you heard, we've got a lot to cover over the next 60 minutes. So I'm going to invite my Stand Up America colleague, Joy Ray, up to the podium to help facilitate and to get us started.
Thank you, Christina, and thanks everyone for being here. Really excited to hear from this esteemed panel. I'm just going to jump in and start asking questions and really ask questions that are going to lay the groundwork for the entire panel. So I want to start with Nevada Secretary of State candidate Cisco Aguilar to kick us off. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about why you decided to run for Secretary of State and what secretaries of state did in 2020 to ensure that the choices of voters in their states were protected.
Thank you. Thank you, Joy. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. It's an honor to be here to talk about why I'm running for Secretary of State and what Secretary of States across the country are doing to protect our democracy. I'm an attorney. I've worked in the business world, sports world. I served as chairman of the Nevada Athletic Commission, which regulates boxing and UFC. You may ask, well, that's pretty interesting. That is important to Nevada's economy. The amount of events that we hold in Las Vegas and the amount of revenue that comes through from a gaming perspective and the outcomes of those fights and those events is so significant that somebody has to be in charge, and it's somebody who's honest. It's somebody who understands the impact. You are a regulator. You have to have the trust of your constituencies. You have to be fair. You have to be transparent, and you have to be honest. And it's no different from a Secretary of State who regulates elections. In Nevada, the Secretary of State has two major responsibilities. You are a regulator of elections, and you are administrator of corporate and security filings. So you have a big role in economic development of the state. You touch every single business in the state of Nevada. It's also, too, the third largest revenue generator to our general fund. So you are funding programs and initiatives that benefit all of our citizens. And when a passion of mine is I've always had the responsibility. I've worked for Andre Agassi and Stephanie Graf for the last 14 years. They are huge proponents in Nevada. They love their community, and they said, Cisco, you have to have a passion, and you have to be committed to your community. And what are you going to do to pay that community rent? Well, education. My parents aren't well educated. My mom didn't finish high school, but they drove into me and my brothers the importance of education. And you may wonder why that was relatable to the Secretary of State's office. In Nevada, we aren't the best. We need to get better. Our parents deserve better. Clark County, where Las Vegas is located, is the 5th largest school district in the country. It's a majority-minority student and family population. If we're ever going to change our educational outcomes, it's going to be those parents that get to the polls to fight for that fundamental right of education. And when I started to watch what was happening in the 2020 election, I just thought, this is crazy. You cannot disenfranchise these parents from getting to the polls. The access we have as Nevadans to the polls is so critical. We are not your normal state. We are different. We are a 24/7 economy where we have parents working 12-hour shifts. They're working 2 jobs. And when you tell them the only time you can vote is on a first Tuesday in November from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., that's not going to work. We are fortunate to have a legislature and a governor who passed amazing voter access legislation, early voting, mail voting. It's, top-down voter registration. And one thing that we can be proud of as Nevadans is we've seen a 25% increase in participation in voting from our Native communities. That's significant, but it's not enough. We have to continue to do more. And when I hear people are trying to limit that access, that's what gets me fired up. I don't shy away from a fight. I like a good fight, but I want it to be fair and know that we're fighting for people who this really matters, and it matters to our state. When you ask about what we're doing across the country, Democratic Association of Secretary of States has really strong leadership in the chair. That's Jenna Griswold, the Secretary of State in Colorado. And what she's done to provide that access to every voter and to protect that access is something that we all take real pride in, and we are all committed together to fighting that. We have Michigan, we have Georgia, we have Colorado, we have Arizona, and we have Nevada, where we're all questioning this idea, what does democracy mean? Well, it means access to the voting polls, because every fundamental right starts there. And recently we've seen with the Supreme Court's decision on a woman's right to choose the health care she wants, we cannot allow that. That's just the beginning. But the only way we're going to stand up and fight is by getting to the polls, and we need to ensure everybody has that access.
So you talked a little bit about what we're going to do this year, but I want to look a little bit ahead. How could secretaries of state who are not committed to democracy undermine the choices of voters in 2024 and beyond? And feel free to talk a little bit about what could happen in Nevada specifically if your opponent wins.
Absolutely. Again, your responsibility as Secretary of State is a regulator. It is your job to call a strike and a ball a ball. You don't have the ability to determine what it is just because of your personal preference. In Nevada specifically, and like Arizona, we are battleground states. We have the potential to determine who our next president is in 24. And if my opponent is elected Secretary of State in Nevada, he can not only influence the outcome of that election, he can ensure that his friends are the ones that are winning those elections. And that is irresponsible. It's irresponsible of him and what he's doing with our voters in Nevada and the information he's providing. We need to be fair, we need to be open, and we need to be transparent. So the fact that a Secretary of State in Nevada could determine the outcome of an entire country's election is really scary. And we need to ensure that you are there. In Nevada, the counties, let me go back for a little bit of a piece here. The counties, there's 17 in Nevada. They oversee elections, they execute elections, they certify the elections, and then send those to the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State then submits those to the Nevada Supreme Court for certification. If my opponent wins, he has the ability as a regulator to interpret regulation, statute, into a way that is unfair or detrimental to all Nevadans. He would do it to bias his friend's success at the expense of all Nevadans, and that's where he could have a major influence in the outcome. For example, Nye County in Nevada, just this county commission there voted to do all paper ballots and hand counting. That's 30,000 ballots that are going to be done by paper and are going to be hand counted. We have another county, Esmeralda, which has 300 voters. They voted. It took 8 hours to count those 300 votes. And you talk about the fiscal irresponsibility in those decisions is significant when that community probably has different priorities than paper and hand counting ballots. They are fighting for education, they're fighting for infrastructure, they're fighting for health care. But yet you have a group of individuals to determine that the priority is paper ballots, and that's irresponsible.
For that. So continuing to lay the groundwork here, I have one last question for you. In addition to your own race, are there other races that you recommend we keep an eye on?
Absolutely. I think I was born and raised in Tucson, Arizona. My parents live in Tucson. So I'm very worried about their vote at county, right? If Fincham is elected or has the opportunity to be elected, that's scary. We need to watch Arizona. We need to watch Colorado. We need to watch Georgia. B. Wynn is a phenomenal candidate who's going to work for all Georgians. We have Michigan and we have Minnesota. Those are the states that are really impactful, especially, again, going back to Nevada and Arizona, being battleground states in 24. We need to know that the people that are holding these offices are, again, going to do it in the interest of all voters. It's not about being beneficial to Democrats. It's not about being beneficial to Republicans. It's about the future of your state and knowing that you control that outcome and doing it in a way that's fair. So, thank you.
So continuing our conversation about the importance of individuals who are running for office, I'd like to invite Michael Ambler of the ACLU to introduce himself and to tell us a little bit about why Supreme Court races at the state level are so important to protecting the 2024 election and how who wins or loses these races can impact the 2024 election.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who's here. My name is Michael Ambler, he, him, and I'm a senior campaign strategist at the American Civil Liberties Union, and in that role I head up our engagement on state Supreme Court races. So I think it's important to start with a really fundamental reason why state Supreme Courts are so important, and that is that they can find rights in state constitutions that exceed those that the Supreme Court of the United States or federal courts have found in the U.S. Constitution. And we've seen that strategy be really successful in states that have good Supreme Courts. In North Carolina, for example, where the state Supreme Court has regularly found that the provisions of the North Carolina Constitution that deal with voting prohibit practices like voter suppression, like gerrymandering, like changing mail-in voting rules at the last minute. But there's another really fundamental reason why state Supreme Courts are so important, and that may be obvious to folks who, like myself, come out of the campaign world, but these are statewide elections. And so in many states that have extremely hostile and heavily gerrymandered majorities or supermajorities that are working to undermine the elections, these are a firewall that can oversee those elections, much like secretaries of state, that cannot be gerrymandered. So in states like Pennsylvania, North Carolina, even Kansas, there are very hostile legislative majorities that have state Supreme Courts actively working to overturn those decisions or block them from going into effect. I think a really good illustrative example is Pennsylvania here. When the majorities in the legislature were lost in 2010, progressives in Pennsylvania put a huge amount of energy into capturing or recapturing the state Supreme Court. In 2015, they elected 3 Democrats. I could talk for hours about what a brilliant campaign that was. So if anyone wants to hear me praise Pennsylvania Democrats, come find me afterwards. But we saw the results of that in 2020, where the Pennsylvania Supreme Court upheld mail voting for 8.7 million voters, and where they struck down one of the most aggressive, unconstitutional gerrymanders in the country and put into place what are effectively fair maps. Now, the Pennsylvania legislature is now, moving into 2024, attempting to subpoena the personal information of every single voter in the state who participated in the last two elections. That includes details like credit scores, like social security numbers. Again, the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court is going to, I think it's fair to expect, block what is a pretty transparent case of voter intimidation. I think the best way to illustrate how effective the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court has been is actually what the legislature has done in response. They're attempting to pass a constitutional amendment that would actually change, this is completely unprecedented, change these races from being elected statewide to actually creating districts for each court member so that they could then gerrymander those districts. So that's the fight we have to have now, and I think it really illustrates both how powerful courts can be and also the threats to them that we have to be careful of. So we talked a little bit about gerrymandering. There are many issues related to election integrity, all of which will ultimately end up in front of state Supreme Courts. I won't go into all of them, but they cover voting rights, voter suppression, mail-in voting. They cover bills like those in Georgia that have attempted to change the days that voting can be conducted to suppress often black communities or communities of color. But there's another one that I think hasn't gotten as much attention, and I think it's really important, which are partisan election reviews. We have a lot of experts on Arizona up here, so I won't go really deeply into what Arizona Republicans are trying to do. But these bills that would allow the legislature to effectively approve or reject elections without any particular rationale or evidence, I think Arizona is leading the way, not in a positive sense, but other states are working on similar proposals, and those are all, again, going to end up being tested against state constitutions as interpreted by state Supreme Courts. So just quickly, I want to go over the states that have, I think, really meaningful elections coming up. Ohio and North Carolina both have active cases on voter suppression and gerrymandering in front of their courts. Montana and Michigan also have upcoming competitive state Supreme Court races that will determine control of those courts. And then lastly, Kansas, which is where the Supreme Court has effectively made Kansas a lone outpost of abortion rights and voting rights in a pretty tough part of the country on both those issues. 5 justices are up for retention. And so I think those states in particular, the outcomes are going to determine how those state constitutions are interpreted for the next decade.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. So just to shift gears a bit here, we're talking about some pretty serious topics this afternoon, and I'm also feeling the post-lunch low energy in the room a little bit. So we're going to try to amp up the energy as we shift gears and talk about how democracy is literally on the ballot this fall in Michigan and Arizona. So first, Sharon, let's start with you in Michigan. I'd love for you to introduce yourself, talk a little bit about the Promote the Vote 22 ballot initiative, and specifically how, if it's approved, it would protect the 2024 election and beyond.
All right, I'll do my best to amp everybody up. First of all, where are my Pennsylvania people out there? Born and raised right here, Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia, but I've been in Michigan for the last 2 decades, so I'm going to talk about Michigan. So I'm a senior advisor at Promote the Vote. I'm a voting rights advocate. I've been doing that for 2 decades in Michigan. Why is that important? Because what you see when you do that job is the barriers that voters have on election day, right? If you are sitting in a boiler room taking the calls on those hotlines, you become very intimately familiar with the challenges and the problems that voters are facing, right? And so very quickly I realized, we need to do more to deal with the structures. We need to do more with constitutions. We need to do more with statutes. So let's talk about Promote the Vote 2022. This is a constitutional amendment. It will be on the November ballot for Michigan voters to vote on this fall. And it, first and foremost, is about advancing and expanding voting rights, okay? It's not our job to spend all of our time playing whack-a-mole with individuals who want to engage in voter suppression. If we do that in our democracy space, we will, in my opinion, fail, because we'll be playing on their field. We'll be playing their game instead of the game that we want to play, which is to expand and increase access to voting. So first and foremost, it's going to expand voting rights. You can check it out online. I'm not going to list out all 10 planks, but at promotethevote2022.com, read all about it. But to give you some highlights, it enshrines the fundamental right to vote in the Constitution. Okay, hard stop. Let's get the words in there. After the Dobbs decision, we know that we cannot rely on the interpretations of courts that we have a fundamental right to vote. Second, an example is extending the deadline for military and overseas voters to get their ballots back. Okay, they are the folks that are by definition often farthest away and are struggling at higher percentages and rates than voters that are closer to home. Another example is 9 days of early voting. 9 days of early voting is both an advancement and an expansion of voting rights, but it is also a security measure for a lot of voters. There are voters across the political spectrum who want to vote in person. It is their experience, it is the habit that they have, and it feels good to put the ballot directly into a machine at this time in which people are concerned, right? They're concerned that their vote is going to be tossed out. So those are some of the ways that it's expanding voting. But how is it defending against election subversion? Number one, we will not allow any partisan audits, any sham audits that are actually driven by partisan actors who are unhappy with the outcomes of the election. Hard stop. Partisan officials should not be running an audit. It can't really be an audit if a partisan official is running it. Another component of Promote the Vote 2022, this is going to be earth-shattering. Election results should be based on the votes cast. Doesn't sound very controversial, does it? But let's make sure it's in the Constitution. And why? Because you heard some things here. I think I heard that Arizona is maybe trying to have something where the legislature could determine the outcome. Guess what? Michigan already has that statute. It says that in a contested election, undefined what that is, the legislature can determine the outcome of the election, okay? We know that's not how it goes, so let's just be very clear in the Constitution who determines the outcomes of elections. And then finally, clearly and strictly defining the role of certification boards. In our state, we call them canvassing boards. You know, you heard about how Nevada certifies its elections, right? Every state has a different way. We have what are called canvassing boards, but those individuals do not have some independent authority to determine the election results. They are actually counting. They are counting the votes, and the votes are then being counted by the next level, and they're being counted by the next level. There is no independent discretion to determine what the election results are. So these are all the things that nearly meant that Michigan's results were not certified in 2020. And this constitutional amendment will ensure that all of those problems are dealt with, all those opportunities are removed, while, again, focusing on our goal of advancing voting rights. So we'll be on the ballot in November, and not just for the 2024 election, but we will have local elections between now and then. All of these protections will be in place for all of our future elections.
Thank you, and 100% agree that making sure everyone can actually access the ballot protects our elections as well, so thank you for that. Backtracking a little bit, Sharon, tell us a little bit about the circumstances in Michigan that eventually led to this movement for a statewide ballot initiative.
Yeah, so I think there's two things to start with. One, you should know that in 2018, we passed the most aggressive voting rights ballot initiative ever anywhere in the country. And so we had, and that may surprise you, right? You may see things and read things about Michigan that I would humbly suggest that you may not believe, you maybe shouldn't believe, okay? Because we won that ballot initiative in 80 of 83 Michigan counties. It wasn't controversial at all, okay? So we go into the 2020 election, we see a mob show up an attempt to block the counting of more than half the ballots in Detroit, the largest majority black city in this country. But we're not done there. Don't worry, I won't take you through every horrible thing that happened in Michigan that year, but let's go to the second thing. The legislative leaders go to Washington, D.C., so that former President Trump can ask them to overturn the election results. Because remember I said there's a statute that says in a contested election, the legislature can determine it. But we're not done. Then we have those canvassing boards, those certifying boards that nearly refuse to certify the vote for Wayne County, which includes Detroit. And then we nearly see the state almost fail. And only one of the two Republicans joins in certifying the elections. So all of this, this tragedy, all these entirely undemocratic actions and election subversion efforts happen in 2020, but that's not the end of it. In early 2021, the Michigan Republican Party, in name, I am not being partisan, they came out and said we're going to pass a voter suppression ballot initiative. We're not done yet. Dozens and dozens of voter suppression statutes and bills are introduced in the legislature, right? So at this time, we see all this, terrible things happening. But as I said, if we are going to do the work of passing a constitutional amendment, we need to ask ourselves, what do we need to do? Not react only to these attacks. And so what we did was we went out and talked to Michigan voters. What do they want? With a ballot initiative, you've got to get statewide support, right? And one of the things that we found, that we often find, and this is why I say please don't believe all that you read and see, is that the voters of Michigan, the majority, do not support the kinds of things that I just described, okay? They don't. What we found is the voters of Michigan want an accessible and secure election, both. They do not think there's any reason to choose between the two, and in fact, when you push them, they will not sacrifice access for the sake of security. So again, don't believe everything you read. So again, we, after talking to voters and actually understanding what voters and citizens of the state of Michigan want instead of elected officials, we develop a package of proposals. We figure out what Michigan needs to deal with the threats, but also how do we advance voting rights. And hopefully we'll be done in November with a success.
Y'all, Sharon and the other organizers in Michigan are doing some amazing work. Congratulations on your successes so far. And I know later, Joy will ask the question of everyone, what do you need to win? But I do just want to take and what the folks in this room can do to help. But I do just want to take a moment to say the extent to which anybody sitting in this room or anybody who's watching on the live stream, I'm looking at the camera at you, has access to resources to help fund these ballot initiatives. They're incredibly important for the people of Michigan, and you'll hear for the people of Arizona, but also for our democracy and for our entire country. So now that I've made that plug, we'll keep going with the Q&A. So Joel, I want to take it over to you. I want to invite Joel Edmond of Arizonans for Fair Elections to introduce himself, to talk a little bit about the initiative they expect to be on the ballot this year in Arizona, and also to tell us about what inspired this ballot initiative and how it changed over time.
Thank you. And in addition to that, I'll start with 2 Mark Fincham facts, just because he's come up a couple of times, and want to wake folks up. I saw a quote yesterday. I don't know if that's me or I'm hearing like a buzzing, whatever. A Republican state senator in Arizona named Paul Boyer referred to Mark Fincham as the dumbest member of the legislature. And as the senator pointed out, there's quite a lot of competition for that. The other thing I wanted to say is that he's actually from Michigan. He moved out to Arizona and dresses up like a cowboy, so people will think that he's from Arizona, but call him the Kalamazoo cowboy. That's not what I'm here to talk about, though. So Arizonans for Fair Elections, check out azfairelections.com to learn more about the initiative, and I'll talk about the history. I'm Joel. I'm with the Arizona Democracy Resource Center. I use he, him pronouns, and with ADRC Action, where we're holding the Arizonans for Fair Elections campaign, along with a coalition of local community organizations that are predominantly Latina-led, Black-led, and with a lot of input from indigenous voting rights activists into what would end up being in the policy for fair elections. We actually started this in 2020. We were starting to collect signatures in the winter, spring of 2020. and had to shut down when the pandemic came and are bringing it back for 2022. The reason I wanted to start with that is because our vision as a coalition in putting together the Fair Elections Act wasn't really just envisioning 2024, but 2030 and beyond, and what we wanted a democracy to look like and feel like in Arizona. At the Resource Center, we believe democracy has to belong to the people and has to live with the people, and that means access, yes. It also means that our voices actually decide elections, and it means that the folks that get elected then have to prioritize our priorities and not their donors or lobbyists. And so we wanted to have a real holistic approach to building democracy in Arizona, and that's what the Fair Elections Act does. So there's sort of 4 main pillars in the act. One is a similar sort of sweeping set of voting rights protections. We're also tired every year of defending our right to vote from the folks at the state legislature who want to take it away and chip away at different means of access to voting. So we would protect the right to vote by mail, the right to vote in person, the right of persons with disabilities to use curbside or alternative means of voting, the right for the 22 federally recognized tribes in our state to have a say over where and when polling locations are going to be open on and near tribal lands, and a whole host of other voting protections for our citizens in Arizona. In addition to that, protecting against election sabotage, so stopping the legislature from overturning our results, similar to what Sharon was talking about in Michigan, a similar rule preventing another sham election review like they ran at the Coliseum downtown in Phoenix last year, protections on our ballot initiative process. The people of Arizona have started using ballot initiatives for broadly progressive means over the last few election cycles, starting really in 2016 when we raised the minimum wage and gave a right to paid sick leave to folks across the state. And the Arizona Chamber of Commerce and their allies at the legislature have ramped up a campaign ever since then to make it nearly impossible to get these things on the ballot and qualified and passed. And if not impossible, onerously expensive, as we can tell you, and we'll come back to when we ask for how you all can help. And so we would go back and undo some of those barriers that they have put in place to this very initiative process. We know whether it's for abortion rights or a whole host of other topics that we're going to need the initiative process in Arizona for the people to be able to decide how things are going to go in our state. And then lastly is trying to reform the influence of money, in particular corporate and lobbyist money, in our politics. The state of Arizona, we, the voters in 1998, created by an initiative a clean elections public financing program for candidates to be able to access limited amount of public funds to run for state offices. And it was wildly successful. And because it was wildly successful in bringing in particular, women and working class folks and people of color into our legislature, and in limiting the influence of moneyed interests at the Capitol, those same moneyed interests came back with a litigation strategy that went up to the U.S. Supreme Court to take a big chunk of the efficacy of that clean elections program out. In the last few cycles, they have more than tripled the contribution limits that they can receive, they meaning the state legislature, the majority there. And we have, I think, hilariously loophole-ridden lobbyist gift ban in Arizona that we would go through and remove some of those loopholes. For example, so the law says that you can't give, a lobbyist cannot give a gift to an elected official or staff. But then gift is defined in the law to not include food or travel or various other things. But those are the two things, I mean, those are the gifts that I want, first of all. So anyways, we would radically limit both of those to try to really shift. Again, not just protecting our election in 2024 and all the outcomes going forward, but really trying to recenter people in our democracy who so often, whether it's in funding education, leading to the teacher walkouts in 2018, and as the son of two teachers, I definitely lived that growing up, the generational disinvestment from our public schools, whether it's that or protecting abortion access, our right to health care, affordable food, community safety, all of these things, they will only happen if people are actually at the center of our democracy. And so that's what the Fair Elections campaign is all about.
Thank you, Joel. So I know we first started talking about this ballot initiative with you back in 2019. when the hopes of passing it in 2020 were dashed by COVID and the difficulty of collecting ballot signatures during the pandemic. A lot has happened in Arizona since then. I think, across the country, we've seen the sometimes successful voter suppression attempts in Arizona. We've seen fraud happen in Arizona. Can you say a little bit about how this ballot initiative would address some of those concerns and how it might have changed over time?
Yeah, absolutely. We as Arizona, we tend to lead both in very bad ways and sometimes in our elections in good ways. We have a sort of mishmash of policies from over the years. We were one of the first states to adopt universal voting by mail without needing an excuse and online voter registration. The legislature, though, last year decided for the first time to remove the permanent status. You used to be able to sign up to get your ballot in the mail every election. You didn't have to use it every election. As long as you were an eligible registered voter in Arizona, it was going to keep coming to you automatically. And that is a huge tool for people to participate, especially in local elections that tend to have lower turnout. Having a ballot show up in the mail is a pretty good way to find out that there's an election going on, right? But now, if you don't use those ballots often enough, then folks are going to start to get removed from what's no longer called the permanent early voter list to the active early voter list, unless we can pass fair elections, because that's one of our policies, is to restore the PEVL. But we also went and looked at the other areas specifically the legislature has been targeting for attack. They, especially in rural parts of our state, where a lot of our indigenous voters live, they have been targeting drop boxes. They've been targeting the ability to drop off your ballot inside of a polling place. So all of these would be protected in the law. The sham review I mentioned wouldn't be able to happen again after this is passed. So yeah, I talk about this as sort of a combination of defensive, making sure we don't have to keep fighting the same defensive fights every year and just hoping each year that things break right in the legislature for us to do, have them do just a little damage and not a lot of damage. But also, to move beyond this, the sort of four corners of that, of just protecting what we have right now from attack, and making it so that everybody can be registered automatically when you go and get a driver's license at our MVD, that if you fall through the cracks of that, you're able to register when you go to vote. And your, of course, registration will get processed before your ballot is counted, but you have that ability to go and register at the time that you vote. These are things that are, a world away from the conversation happening at our state capitol, but are what it means to really be a democracy, right, where we all actually have access and that our voices all really matter. So, yeah, hopefully when we win, we'll both be able to, I'm sure there'll be defensive fights to fight. They'll come up with something new. But hopefully stop fighting around basic access. We may be fighting on implementing the Fair Elections Act, but that's more fun. The proactive is always way more fun.
Absolutely. So raise your hand if you knew about either of these ballot initiatives in Michigan or Arizona before you came into this room today.
Oh, some people do.
All right, we got a decent number of hands. All right. I'm going to pass it back over to my colleague, Joy, who I'm sure will be more appropriately sober at this point than I am.
Tagging in for the lightning round. So now I'd love to just invite all of you to talk a little bit about, this is a question for all the panelists, the opposition and who it is for each of your respective causes. Why are they opposing you? How well organized are they and how well funded are they? If you could talk a little bit about that, and we can start here.
Great. Love the opportunity to speak about. Love the opportunity to speak about my opponent. Obviously, he's ideologically different than from what I am. He believes that voting should be limited to a select few and that they should determine the outcome and the vision of our state. However, he served in the legislature in Nevada for one term, recently ran against Congressman Horsford in his seat last cycle, did not win. Now he's running for Secretary of State because he believes our president wasn't duly elected, which is completely false. We currently have a Republican Secretary of State in Nevada, and she's done a phenomenal job in ensuring that the voting system in Nevada is secure and strong, and also certifying elections in a way that should be determined by all Nevadan voters. If he were in position or in the Secretary of State's role, he would not have certified the election and would not have ruled that Biden won. He would have ruled the other way. As far as funding, look, his people and his supporter and his base is going to come out 100% to vote. That is the scary part. There were 7 candidates on the Republican side in the primary. One of those individuals spent $2 million in that race and did not beat my current candidate or opponent. That is scary. Again, it sends a message that I need to make sure that we have the resources, we have the right game, we have the right plan to be able to beat him. Because if we do not, it'll be impactful on Nevada for decades. And not only just in Nevada, but he is the chair or the clubhouse leader of all of these election deniers throughout the country. And the more and the bigger platform he gets, the bigger that message becomes. And we gotta shrink that platform. What scares me is that in an instant, somebody could endorse his candidacy in Nevada and he could get the resources he needs to be able to run an extremely competitive campaign. But we cannot let that happen. Nevadans are smarter than what this guy believes they are. He's irresponsible in the information he's providing them. And it's unfortunate because that's not who we are. Nevadans, we are a purple state. We are hardworking individuals. We are one of the most diverse states when you talk about ethnic makeup, but also from a workforce base. And so I think people are going to realize that the information he's given is inaccurate and it's wrong. And hopefully he will not win this election because we are going to be so strong and so forceful that we are going to tell him, nobody wants you here in Nevada. Go away.
Thank you for that. Sharon, if you can answer the same question.
The Republican nominee for Secretary of State is opposing us. And interestingly, following up on what you just said, she did a long interview, not just making false claims about her proposal, but making all kinds of inaccuracies just about the basics of how elections are run. So basic that the reporter themselves was in the story was saying, she said this, that's not true. She said this, that's not how elections work. Like, it was a fascinating article. So she'll be opposing us. A Trump PAC has contributed only to our opposition. Let me rephrase that. The only ballot initiative to receive any donations from a Trump PAC is one that has said it will run a significant campaign against us. The voter suppression ballot initiative that I mentioned early on, they submitted their signatures a couple weeks ago, so that is like looming on the horizon for us, and they said they'll run a significant campaign against us. So, what you spoke about shrinking the platform, I think that's also really relevant, right? Because they have been talking about the big lie nonstop in Michigan and many of the other states represented here for 2 years, right? So they have been talking about, they've basically been running an opposition campaign for 2 years, right? The good news is Michigan voters aren't buying it, right? We went out, we talked to them, that's not their philosophy, but it means that they do have a significant head start on establishing their narrative, right? And talking their talking points. And so, it's going to be an expensive and a significant campaign, but I believe the Michigan voters are with us.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll pick up from that same point about the opposition sort of running their messaging over the last couple of years with the sham review, et cetera, in Arizona. And I mean, we really see this when we're talking to people one-on-one or in our polling, that folks really have sort of been pushed to one camp or the other. The good news is our camp, the camp that believes in democracy, is a lot bigger. So as long as our folks turn out to vote, we should win. Now, the opposition has sort of unveiled themselves in Arizona and are, of course, also pushing their version of disinformation about our initiative already. And they announced a list of 31 campaign co-chairs. 3 of them are lobbyists. 4 of them are the Republican members of the U.S. House from Arizona, all 4 of whom voted to overturn the 2020 election. And then the rest are sitting state legislators in Arizona. All of the members of the state Senate, except for the state senator Boyer I referenced earlier, who's not on this list, voted to arrest the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors over the 2020 election. So if you go through the list of legislators, it's all election deniers and folks who voted for quite a few voter suppression bills. So the usual suspects, who we expected basically to be showing up as our opposition. In a lot of ways, that's good news for us. But we do expect that they will be well funded. Would anticipate national funding in a similar way that Sharon's talking about. And they've hired one of Joe Arpaio's campaign consultants from his last run for sheriff to run the opposition campaign. So in many ways, it's sort of the usual suspects getting together to fight democracy. But we do expect that they'll be well-resourced and need to be well-resourced to push back and tell our story and the story of our people. But again, we know that most people are with us. And as long as we have the ability to communicate what the Fair Elections message is about, that we'll win.
Thank you. Please.
So there really are two parallel tracks I want to talk about when it comes to the opposition on state Supreme Court races. And those are the electoral side, which I've already talked a little bit about, and then the legislative side. And I think it's important to be honest up front, our opposition got here first. There has been a long and pretty successful project by Republicans to build power in the judiciary, both at the state and federal level. I'm sure everyone's heard about the Federal Society and the work that's gone into recruiting a bench of really radical judges at every single level. And we're now coming to this fight, but we have some ground to make up. I think really illustrative there is the fact that always blows my mind. In 2012, 10 years ago, more money was spent by Democrats on primaries than general elections for state Supreme Court judges. So there was more money spent by judges, in New York fighting about the New York State Supreme Court than in what we would consider swing states. That has now changed. Last year, $97 million was spent across all the state Supreme Court races. That's an increase of about tenfold from a decade ago. We expect that number to almost double this cycle. So a lot more resources are coming to bear. The type of money the opposition is spending is changing too. For a long time, the money that was going to state Supreme Court races, it was mostly business interests. It was deregulatory. It was people who didn't want courts ordering them to pay fines for polluting. That still exists to some degree, but it's now being joined by election deniers and the type of, the exact same folks we're hearing about on this panel. That is obviously really concerning. I think it's also an opportunity. Those business interests that funded Republican courts for judicial candidates, for a long time, I think it's an uncomfortable alliance. And I think that there have already been some attempts to kind of prise that open and make it harder for groups like the Chamber of Commerce or even local business interests in some states to back candidates who are running, frankly, on a platform of I will never permit a Democrat to win an election in my state. The other track here is legislative, and I think that's one that, again, needs more attention than it's currently getting. Since the 2020 election, there have been 135 bills in 34 state legislatures aimed at reducing the power of the judiciary to intervene in elections-related cases. It's 135 bills. It's a staggering number every time I think about it. Those bills would do everything from making it harder for judges to change vote-by-mail rules, make it harder for them to intervene in election-related cases at all, and most egregiously, actually remove all elections-related disputes to special panels, not courts, that can be appointed by the legislature or the Chief Justice in states where the Chief Justice is currently a Republican. And I think the last thing I'll say there that really sort of makes that stick out, in two states where I'm working, in Ohio and North Carolina, the person who would appoint those panels is the son of the most powerful Republican in the state. Two states, not one. In North Carolina, it would be the son of the Republican majority leader. And in Ohio, it would be the son of the governor. Both are currently Republican state Supreme Court justices. So if you're ever looking for a factoid on how perverse these bills are, that's the one that always sticks out to me. So really, it's a full court press by the opposition. I think we're ramping up our end of the fight, but we can't sleep on either of those two angles of attack, because if either of them are successful, if we lose those elections, or if the courts themselves are made irrelevant to these cases, we're going to lose, in many states, the strongest firewall we have to protect election rules.
Wow, thank you for that. Christina, before we move into Q&A, Christina foreshadowed the question of, you just heard about how the opposition is operating and how difficult the challenge is ahead. So don't be shy in answering this question. Don't be shy at all. I'm going to invite everyone here to just say a little bit about how folks in this room and folks watching here today can help. What can we do to help you? And we'll start with you again, Mike.
Well, obviously it wouldn't, these panels wouldn't be complete if we didn't hit you up for change.
Monetary change.
Yes. These races are all incredibly close. Michigan, North Carolina, Ohio, Montana, hopefully not the Kansas retention, we're keeping a close eye on it. Those races for state Supreme Court, every single one of them are polling within the margin of error. And this includes even in places where Republicans are expected to perform pretty well. We have found in our research that talking about things like judicial integrity, voters actually care about that. I think in the political operative world, it's easy to kind of become dismissive about ideas like bipartisanship and fairness and judicial ethics as things that don't really move people, but we found these things really do motivate voters. There are crossover voters on these issues, but they need to hear the message. They need to have someone explain to them why these races are so important, because frankly, not many people think about their state Supreme Courts. I mean, a lot of people don't even know they exist, or that they're separate from federal courts anyway. And so that education program is expensive, but important. So for those of you who have C3 arms or can give C3 money, that voter education is really important. For those of you who are in my preferred world of running attack ads, that funding is really important too. I would love to talk to anyone who has some spare change rattling around in their coffee jar on where that can go, but please invest in these campaigns, because the other thing I should say quickly before I run out of time, if we don't win these, we will have lost in some of these states at least 10 years of opportunity to change the composition of these courts. This is a year where we have an unprecedented number of court balances being decided. Those years don't come around every election cycle. So it's the money you spend now will be way more impactful than it will be 2 years from now.
Thank you. Please, Joel.
Yeah, please check out azfairelections.com. Tell all of your friends. Really, I was gratified, as with Sherrod and I, to have a few people raise hands knowing that you already knew about the Michigan or Arizona ballot initiatives. Tell all of your friends about them. And, whatever state Supreme Court or Secretary of State races are happening in your states, I'm really grateful that more and more people are following them, but it largely depends on folks who have the opportunities to be in spaces like this, letting people know in your circles. I heard about these things that are happening in Arizona and Michigan, because while they will be, the fair elections would be transformative for Arizona, it will also be critical for America, right? That's why we're talking about this in the context of 2024. And so, of course, if you've got $20 to throw us individually, if you are connected to an organization that can make contributions financially, you can find out how to do that on the website. But we are also looking for folks to volunteer. If you have an organization or any sort of folks that are in Arizona in your networks that you can reach out to get them plugged in to volunteer with us, we'd be really grateful for that too. But really spreading the word. Because I know on election night, after we see what happens with us, I'm going to be looking to see what happened in Michigan, but I don't know that if enough people around the country know about the importance of these two ballot measures in addition to the SOS races and Supreme Court races around the country.
I'll try not to repeat. And I'll just, for folks who maybe aren't, money is not necessarily the way, I just really want to speak to putting my voter education sort of election protection hat on. I just really want to emphasize, even if you are not running an organization that is encouraging people to vote down ballot, we all know that the most important people in any voter's life are their friends and family in terms of influencing their behavior, right, and their community members. And so I think if we can do more, we started doing this in Michigan, again, in my other roles in 2020 of talking about the state Supreme Court, how are they nominated? Where are they on the ballot? When you vote straight party, you don't actually vote for them. Things they'll be at the bottom. You might have to flip it over. If you want more information, there'll be a summary. Get a sample ballot so you don't have to be nervous when you go in there, if you're going in person. I really, again, those kinds of things I really, in my heart of heart, believe are so impactful for converting more people to participate in these down-ballot elections. Because we all know on this panel that roll-off is a significant problem with our, often our supporters.
It's resources, resources, resources. Again, telling a message. So I'd ask you to go to cisconv.com, make a contribution. But also, too, tell your friends, the power of small dollar fundraising is significant in a race like mine. That could potentially impact the 24 election, impacts the entire country. The amount of money we're going to spend in presidential campaigns in 24 and the amount that needs to be invested in a Secretary of State race like mine in Nevada, that is a battleground state, can prove returns beyond anything we could imagine. So again, cisconv.com, and please ask all your friends. Everything helps. Thank you.
And I know I talked about money earlier, but I'll also just say that especially in these judicial races, I think that many of us, even as progressives, aren't as educated as we should be before we go into the voting booth. So I think it's important for us to educate ourselves on judicial races and educate our friends and family to make sure that when we go into the voting booth, we know who we're actually voting for. In addition to, as Sharon said, reaching out to the folks who you may know in Michigan, in Arizona, in Nevada, in other states with key Secretary of State races to make sure that they're flipping the ballot over, that they're looking down the ballot, and that they're voting for people and measures that will protect our democracy.
Thank you, Christina. We're going to come around with a mic for a quick Q&A, but I just invite everyone to please give this group a round of applause.
All right, so we have time for a few questions. I'm going to pop off of this stage and bring the mic to folks who have questions. So just raise your hands. Anybody have a question? All right.
How can you see? How can you see out there? I can't.
She is not a plant. However, this is someone that I know. Maria, thank you for asking a question.
Thank you. Hi, Maria Martinez, pronounced she, her. I'm with the Alliance for Justice. You all kind of touched on this a bit, but would love to hear a little bit more about just overall voter education. So I agree that I think as organizers, we have to prep ourselves and educate ourselves on all these judicial races. And speaking to your everyday voter, it's already hard to even engage them in midterm elections. It's even hard to reach your Latino voter, Black voter, API voter, and engage them in their local elections. But just curious to hear what are some best tactics on how to just engage those voters, examples of what that engagement looks like, and if there are any existing initiatives already that, for instance, ACLU is working on, or in your state specifically, and how can we all be best allies to each other? Because I'm sure we all have resources, we all have programs that we're running, but just curious to hear exactly just more, I guess, the specificity on how to engage those voters.
Who wants to take that first? Michael?
I can speak to that a little bit. Is this?
Yeah, you're
Can you hear me okay? So first of all, you're all shadows because the light is so bright. So I hope I'm addressing this in the right direction. First of all, did I hear you right that you're with the Alliance for Justice, AFJ? Okay, so first of all, before I even got to your answer, I'm so sorry, but I want to give a huge shout out to the work that AFJ is doing on this exact issue. I talked a little bit about how the Federal Society and some Republican institutions got there ahead of us in terms of recruitment, in terms of a judicial bench. AFJ has been doing, especially this last year, but for a few years now, absolutely incredible work closing that gap, launching the State Supreme Court Hub, which is the first huge tool for tracking judicial candidates at every level and trying to find diverse and well-qualified candidates for these roles. So I want to give a huge round of applause to AFJ for the work they're doing there. Thank you so much. Sorry, I totally hijacked your question. I think this is incredibly important, and I get into the language of C3, C4 a little bit. What I really mean is voter education when I talk about C3 programs. And I think it is crucial in judicial races because in a lot of these states, voters don't have the first marker they look for when they make a decision, which is partisanship. We're working in a lot of places where there are nonpartisan judicial elections despite very partisan candidates when it comes to how they'll actually behave in office. So I think that there is absolutely has to be even more of an effort and focus on that type of sort of basic education program on, what do state Supreme Courts do, how they can protect you, and when it comes to candidates, what are these candidates, what are they really saying, how will they really behave once they're in office? I know we're here mostly talking about voting rights and democracy issue. I will say I think the most encouraging work that's been done there this year is in the reproductive rights space. There have been really sustained projects, especially by Planned Parenthood, some at the ACLU, which I'll give ourselves a little shout out for, to really work to educate voters on how in a post-Roe landscape, state Supreme Courts can find a right to reproductive rights in state constitutions. And what we've seen is that those efforts, which are mostly happening through traditional boots on the ground organizing, and I'm so happy we can do that again, are incredibly effective in raising the salience of these races to the point where people are actually starting to think about completing their ballot. Last thing I'll say before I want to turn it over is historically, state Supreme Court races have had one of the sharpest drop-offs of any race on the ballot, even sharper than what we traditionally think of as bottom of the ballot races like local legislature, partly again because they're nonpartisan and people just don't have those cues. So we're racing to close as much of that gap as possible before these elections.
I want to shout out the work of Chispa, Arizona, on educating folks about the Arizona Corporation Commission. Yeah, thank you. Well, thank them. So the Corporation Commission, it's a little different. It's not a court. It is partisan, but the elections. But the name doesn't suggest or tell anybody really about what they do. Their main function is they regulate our utilities. They set our utility rates and what the renewable requirements are going to be for our utilities. They do other things, but those are the two big things that get people's attention. And I think CHISPA's done a really great job. And instead of starting from this is the Corporation Commission and here are its functions and powers and blah blah blah, but what are your utility rates like this month? What are they like in the summer, right? Wouldn't you like it if they could be a little bit lower? Wouldn't you like it if it was easier to get solar panels on your roof? That kind of thing. That's like about somebody's daily life. And then did you know there's this obscure agency that has power over that and you get to decide who runs it, right? But I think that's a huge place to start is how do these people's decisions connect to your daily life before you even get to like, here's what this court is or whatever.
Yes, here I come.
Hi, thank you so much. I wanted to see what the update is because earlier in the year there was talk of competing in both Arizona and Michigan, talk of competing ballot initiatives, one making things worse from the Republicans and what you're doing, and they would have similar names, and that would have been a bad situation. What's the update? Are we in the clear in both states? What happened?
So the voter suppression one is misnamed Secure My Vote. It doesn't make your voting any more secure or accessible. They did not submit their signatures in time to put themselves, hold on, it's not a perfect story in the end. They did not submit their signatures in time to be on the ballot this November. But remember, they were never attempting to go on the ballot. So what was particularly horrendous and malicious about this voter suppression ballot initiative is they want to use the indirect democracy mechanism in Michigan, which means that you collect a certain number of signatures, you submit them, and then the legislature can simply vote it into law without it ever going to the governor or ever going to the people. So the good news is, so they're in the process now, and it's back back on the burner, I guess, right? But ours is a constitutional amendment, and theirs is a legislative initiative. So many of the elements of ours would overrule theirs.
I'd like to go back to the previous question. As a candidate and out there talking to voters directly every day, it's figuring out what are their challenges, what are their issues, and explaining to them directly how the Secretary of State's office impacts those decisions. especially in Nevada when you talk about our Latino community. You talk about education of their kids is a priority. It was my parents' priority. It's about their jobs. They want to know that they have job security, especially going through what we just went through with COVID in Las Vegas, one of the worst, most challenging economies because of COVID for workers, and then small businesses. And the Secretary of State impacts every one of those because it talks about access to the ballot box. And if they don't have access to the ballot box, they're not going to be able to make those issues a priority. And once they understand that the Secretary of State is going to protect their right to vote and that early access to vote, they get very excited and very engaged, and hopefully they go down ballot and vote for me.
And then in Arizona, there was a competing initiative which failed, but the legislature has referred to the ballot for various anti-democracy measures. One that would more squarely overlap with portions of the Fair Elections Act, but worst case scenario, as long as we win, the vast majority of fair elections will still go into effect. There would be lawsuits if they both win, but it's a much smaller sort of in scope than what we're looking at. And then there are 3 constitutional amendments to attack the initiative process that the legislature's put on the ballot that folks locally are getting organized to try to defeat. So yeah, it's still a combination of proactive and defensive at the ballot, like it so often is for us in Arizona.
Thank you so much, everyone. The tech team in the back is telling us we are out of time for this panel. Thank you all for your questions, and a huge round of applause for the democracy warriors on this stage. And everyone's Twitter handles are up here on the screen, so if there's anybody here you want to get in touch with, of course, come up, but also you can DM them with these Twitter handles right here. Thank you all again for coming.